in the Gospel, we are invited to be giving to those who cannot pay us back. In a supreme way, it is what we're doing right now as we offer the holy sacrifice for souls that we cannot see and who apparently cannot pay us back, and yet we know that those who have a devotion to the holy souls and spend time helping them have surprises. Things start to happen. They do pay us back. And in fact, when a novice way back in the early period in France, given classes by a holy monk who had entered way before the council, already in 1936 he was enclosed, and he had been a priest before entering, a young curate, but he passed on this secret to us, which was common parlance amongst the young priests of France in those pre-war years. It was a secret. If you have an intention that you're really keen on getting heard, offer a holy mass for the holy souls, the poor souls. And so the tradition would go on. The reason, of course, is that they're so grateful when they get out that immediately they get, with regard to gratitude, into business serious time, and the graces come out of the blue. The holy souls is an expression that we have from common devotion. They are holy insofar as at that point they are fixed in the will of God. They no longer sin, and they espouse completely the divine will. Hence they are glad to be there, they see why they are there, and they do not complain. And those who really shouldn't be there, if you see what I mean, they've just made it, are so glad to be there that no matter what the pain and what the delay, they say to themselves, only purgatory. And we know from things that have come back from the beyond that purgatory is not just one common thing, it's a whole domain, as indeed hell itself is not just exactly the same. There are degrees of pain. Now, apparently, the lowest level of all in purgatory is, even in inverted commas, geographically, but in inverted commas, close to hell itself. And the fire there is akin to what is actually in hell itself. And there are some who really should be in hell, but by some mercy of God, perhaps someone else doing it for them, they've just made it, perhaps in a comatose state, some light given to them when apparently they'd gone. But it appears that God, at that point, is doing his very maximum for every bit of eternity, which is a human soul. He doesn't want a single bit lost. He's on side. So it's all happening at that moment. So there may be some surprises at the other end. But for such cases, it could be a huge, long innings down under. Now, in what they call in French le grand purgatoire, the great purgatory, in which initially it's so deep that no help actually reaches them. But they're only there and not that little bit further. So there is hope, and that's the big difference. Now, as time goes on, these levels then are got through. And as a lot of time goes on, if necessary, they get to the last stage of purgatory, and this can actually be quite long, and very holy people can actually be there in this last stage, because arrived at that point, all the other bits of pain, the pain of sense, in which the soul, being the guilty party, having given the commands to the body, is in the faculties of the soul that have been sinful, receiving balance, equilibrium, fair play, justice, perfectly for what it's, as we would say, filched from the order of things. A pleasure taken out of order. Well, it's going back, and it goes back in the form of pain, but not just any pain, but those specific areas, but they're corresponding to what the soul in its spiritual capacities has been commanding, they are being purified, hence the name. Now that is called the pain of sense. As in hell itself, that is going to go on, corresponding, so here in purgatory. Now that's gone by the last stage of purgatory, where we have what is the only bit left. It's a big one, because there is no distraction. It's the pain of loss. Now, the soul is made fundamentally for vision. So if it's not getting there, and if it's getting close to there, there's this terrible pain of wanting, frustration, fundamental lack. But yet, it's not in any way a bitterness or a despair. It's just that it's not made it and it's getting close. Now, we can help them a lot there. So, yesterday, or whenever it was being feasted, the Day of All Souls is one of the days when a very large number of souls are actually liberated. And in a big monastery, it's actually quite moving that day. The big abbey church would be buzzing with celebrations. Traditionally, a priest has the right to have 3 celebrations, and the side altars are actually used a lot on that day. Buzzing of prayer, the holy sacrifice all over the place. Now, with regard to the heavenly choirs, there, what is happening is that the bliss received is quite proportioned in positive to the sacrifices and penances made with the spiritual and bodily faculties in this life. Hence, heaven too has its icing on the cake, its extra bits. It's not just the fundamental bliss of vision, which is the fullness, but the saints will have a colossal glory. The martyrs, just think, have this conformity to Christ on the cross and go like rockets. And there was one mystic soul way back who saw that actually those who had opted for complete sacrifice of themselves, for instance in virginity and the monastic life, and well lived, were amongst actually the ranks of the martyrs, because there was a white martyrdom going on. The will was in Holocaust. It existed no more. They were given, and by profession were conformed to Christ in his cross. The Holocaust of the will. Now, these saints who have in a heroic way corresponded to grace, in the beyond, don't abandon those who have been close to them in this life. There are many cases within the monastic family of things happening to brethren who have gone on. Things are on the frontier, but the frontier is actually quite thin at times. I could tell you quite a few. I remember, amongst many, reading one time information in France about what happened in 1535, thereabouts in Britain. The Carthusian martyrs were the first of the Reformation, and they knew exactly what was at risk. They held out and did not compromise. They had a terrible martyrdom. In fact, St. Thomas More saw them going from his tower in London, and he could see, and he said to his daughter Meg, "Look how they go, like a bridegroom to the wedding feast." They were being carried on these hurdles down to the Tyburn tree to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Now, this was going on, and the monks were being sequestered or separated from outside so as to be worked upon by the authorities to get them to sign, because there were lots of Carthusian monasteries around. And we have, for instance, this tale, that at one point, before it came to the crunch, they were in church and they wanted knowledge from on high as to what to reply to the king's emissaries, because it was confused, the issue. And they were celebrating in red the Mass of the Holy Spirit in the Carthusian Rite. And suddenly they all had a mystic experience, and it's there, you can see it in an old picture. Something similar to what happened at Pentecost took place. Tongues of fire appeared over their heads, and they were being inspired. And of course they were the first to give witness. But there were some who were afraid. There were some who wanted to keep at all costs the house open and so on. And some made a compromise. Now, one day there was a young monk in formation who was a bit of a grump. I could tell you one or two stories, but it'll take time. But I'll just go to the essence. He was next to a lay brother who was about to die, and he was praying with him, accompanying him into the beyond. But the other lay brother, who was a good man, was still lucid. And this young strange monk whispered in his ear, "We know that sometimes things happen when somebody dies. Sometimes a pact can be made. Would you, brother, when you get to the other side, keep this pact? If you're safe and sound on the other side, could you come back and give me word?" So the good brother saw no harm in this and made a promise. And shortly after, he was on the other side. The young brother, or choir monk, was in his cell oratory one day, and he'd forgotten all about this pact, but suddenly before his eyes, as he was saying the choir prayer in cell, he saw before him the soul of this deceased monk, the brother. And he wanted to know what it was like on the other side and how he was doing. And the good brother said that he was in a very good place. It was a very bright situation. But he did add, however, it is not exactly the same brightness as what has happened to the priors. They'd just been martyred at Tyburn. You could see that they were very close to the maximum. And then he, by the way, that doesn't mean he's not satisfied, but he was just pointing out the fact that there's a huge amount of degrees of maximum. Teresa of Lisieux explained it this way: a thimble is full and the ocean is full. The thimble is not complaining. But anyway, it's a question of capacity. And these saints, they had the maximum of capacity. Now, he did warn then, but you, be careful. And he was warning him not to go along with the wish of the king. He could see that he was one of those who could actually go the other way. Alas, he didn't listen. And he was one of those who compromised. He got his liberty. He abandoned the monastic life, went to the continent, lived a very colourful life, and became some kind of cavalier. But anyway, he didn't remain faithful to that call that he had in his youth, not listening also to the powerful grace that specifically he'd been given. But the saints also have specific links with those who have a devotion to them. And they do actually respect acts of devotion physically done to them in the places where there is something of them left. Hence it is that many miracles have always happened in places where saints are buried. It's the basis of our pilgrimage. Now, this happens to be the feast day not only of St. Malachi, but also of St. Martin de Porres and of St. Winifred. I had in Cardiff an elderly friend who had a great devotion to St. Martin de Porres, and she used to invoke him for any occasion. One day, on the main road near where she lived, the Cowbridge Road, a good neighbour of hers was knocked down in a severe accident, and he was in a coma. There was no way of knowing whether he was going to wake up or not. She went immediately to prayer and betook herself to St. Martin de Porres, and she prayed and prayed and prayed. But he was a non-Catholic. He was actually a Salvation Army gentleman. He came to. He eventually gave her the story. I saw this man with dark complexion, not exactly black, but sort of chocolate colour, come up to me. He was dressed in white, but with black over it. And he took me by the hand and pulled me up. Now, she knew exactly what had happened, what that meant, but because he was a Salvation Army person, she never told him what had actually happened, out of delicacy for the other man's faith. But boy, was she grateful to St. Martin de Porres. One day, in student days, I went to St. Winifred's Well, because St. Winifred is also feasted on this day, and I had a few things, 3 things actually, to ask. And the rite is still unchanged since the 6th century when the miracle happened. The story is that she had given her virginity to the Lord. She was of noble family, a kind of princess. But there was the son of a local prince, Caradog, who wanted her hand in marriage and was pretty insistent, and she was refusing. Eventually, he lost it completely, took out his sword and chopped off her head. Now, the story has come down to us in 2 forms. We're not quite sure which is actually the one that corresponds to the fullness of the story, but the other part of the story is this, that her uncle, she was the niece of St. Bainor, abbot of Tonogvar, near where we live, which by the way is miraculous, because he had asked for permission to build this monastery, and he had to make a pledge with the local landlord, and he eventually did it on this stone with his thumb. They made an agreement. St. Bainor made with his thumb the sign of the cross in this stone, and the stone is still there inside the church, now preserved, with a perfect trace of the thumb, which goes right in, corresponds exactly to your thumb in there. He, anyway, is reported to have healed her, put the head back on her body. But whatever happened, when the head fell, as with St. Paul in Rome, in Tre Fontane, 3 fountains, there gushed forth the Holywell, hence the name Holywell, and it's still gushing forth to this day, and it's the one shrine in the British Isles, at least in Britain, where, without a break, it's always happened, and they could not stop it from happening. And we know it because of the graffiti. They were still coming in at the high periods of persecution. The dates are there. People, out of gratitude, chiseling in the dates. And they tried to stop it more than once. But it was always a place where there were hidden priests going around. They knew there were priests, and they were turning a blind eye. They weren't wearing collars, but they were priests, and the sacrifice was being offered there secretly in that corner, right through. And at one point, they did become quite violent and lost patience and tried to stop it. Hitherto, they'd been turning a blind eye, and the people themselves getting healed would go away and say amongst themselves, "Oh, what wonderful water!" and leaving it at that. And eventually, the miracles were such that the authorities were no longer amused, and somebody, or a group of people, about 3 young men, I think, got in on the act and presumed to chop off the head of the ancient statue of St. Winifred. I understand that about 3 days later they were all dead. I don't mean by human hand. So it went on, and no one dared to interfere, and even non-Catholics, as I say, would go. And when I went there, I was very moved, and I asked for these 3 graces, and I think they were granted. One was ordination, definitely. And the experience was such that I immediately wrote this poem to St. Winifred in English and in Welsh with a melody, and then I think I sent it off to the shrine. I think it's still in the archives of the shrine there in Holywell. That's where they put it anyway, the hymn. But as a result, I sent off this hymn, because it was partly in Welsh, to Seren Cymru. That's the Baptist journal, because I knew the editor, Idwal Wyn, very good man. He published it immediately because he was sort of neutral. And it was read then by the Welsh readers, including the wife of a very evangelical Baptist minister, who's still alive. I still write to him, actually. He lives on Anglesey opposite us. In Llanfair Pwll Gwyngyll Gwgero Chwyn Robert Lladysgrif o Goch, as it happens. And there, his wife wanted healing of her severe arthritis, but didn't dare to mention a single thing to her husband, who was very evangelical. So secretly she betook herself, having read this hymn, to the waters and took them with great devotion. And wow! The shock of the healing was such that she wrote to me, because I was an novice at the time, and sent a generous cheque to thank whatever happened for this grace of healing that had come. So I thought, wow, that's interesting, because on the other side, these saints are really ecumenical, which shows the nature of heavenly goodness. And also a hint of the way the Lord comes at our brethren, where he sees a tiny spark of goodwill. He comes into that and zooms into that. So that's where true ecumenism comes into it. We're looking at Jesus together and trying all to get there with our poor means. So St. Winifred is one of the most powerful saints with regard to miracles that have never stopped. There is another one, and I finish with this, that I know sort of from having lived close. We were living in Italy, and we had on one side St. Catherine. In fact, if I had to go to Siena and I'd missed the conventual mass, I would celebrate in front of her head in the Dominican church, in private, her skull. The other was Montepulciano. Now, there is a great saint who died a little before St. Catherine, and she was little angel Agnes, an amazing little hidden gem of sanctity and miraculous activity before and after. It was known, and St. Catherine herself, as a lassie, came on pilgrimage to her. She's there behind the high altar of a Dominican church in Montepulciano. And near it is the picture of what happened where St. Catherine came. She came, and lo and behold, she knelt down to kiss the foot of this little saint. And what happened? The saint, long dead, lifted her foot and put it next to her lips. And all through history and to this present day, big miracles happen with the intercession of that little hidden angel of Montepulciano. We were there one day, and the priest guardian was just telling us how it still happened. He said, "She follows you." He'd had so many cases of people coming to ask for a favour, and she took them at their word and never let them down. So there's a simplicity amongst the saints, and even an almost angelic sense of humour. They're one of us, as it were, but uncontaminated. And sanctity is not hugely complex or intellectual. It's basically that opening of the capacities which have been given to us, so that there's no resistance, but only fullness, and where God is doing all he wants to do without our getting in the way.
St. Winifred. Lines written in student days. After bathing completely 3 times in the ice-cold water that ever since they gushed forth where the martyr's head fell, have produced miracles all through the centuries to this day. O gentle maid, white virgin of a day, that marked all days to come, thou too didst know the treading of a way, found hard at times by some. Thou too didst know well what 'tis to burn, but couldst not be aglow by halves, by quarters, that could this flame turn on more than one, or show what 'twas to love, ere love thou hadst become. Love hadst become, love hadst become. Vorwuning vorn beviosst kind, en dan dros Christe hin, agwen flamois der audas reveth hind, os gan in ma bedien. Tibiost fodlonen haroriais lem, a calon avin roi, I voinagin laboro et oislem, arelin avain troi, e gremodiare gursich moiavin, moiavin, moiavin.